In October 1996, 4 German tourists rented a van, drove into one of the most desolate places in the United States, and then seemed to disappear from the face of the earth. Months later, their vehicle was found abandoned deep in Death Valley, damaged, empty, and surrounded by miles of brutal desert. Strangest of all, search teams looked everywhere you'd expect them to go and found almost nothing. 13 years would pass before one man studied the same map, asked a completely different question, and realized the missing family may have walked in the exact opposite direction from where everyone had been searching. Now, if you like true stories where one small assumption changes the entire mystery, you're definitely in the right place. Around here, those are the kinds of cases we love. Before we get started, please give the like button a desert map, circle the nearest water source, and then quietly replace it with a mirage. Also, subscribe and turn on notifications so you don't miss the next strange case. All right, let's get into it. In October of 1996, a National Park Service ranger was flying over a remote section of Death Valley when he looked down and noticed something that immediately seemed out of place. Sitting alone in a canyon was a green Plymouth Voyager minivan. Now, finding a vehicle somewhere in Death Valley isn't necessarily strange. People drive through the park all the time. But this van wasn't parked near a campground or beside a paved road. It was way out in Anvil Spring Canyon, surrounded by rough desert terrain where you really wouldn't want to take an ordinary family minivan. So the ranger reported it, and eventually investigators made their way out there to see what was going on. And once they reached the van, things got weird pretty fast. One of the tires was destroyed. The wheel itself had been badly damaged, and it looked like whoever had been driving had kept going even after the tire failed. They had basically pushed this van as far into the desert as it could possibly go until the vehicle finally couldn't go any farther. But there was something even more concerning. There was nobody there. Investigators opened the van and found luggage, camping equipment, clothing, and other personal belongings. This didn't look like someone had simply abandoned an old vehicle and walked away from it forever. It looked like a family had been traveling, something had gone wrong, and then everybody inside had suddenly disappeared. The van was quickly traced back to 4 German tourists. There was a man named Egbert Rimkus, his companion Cornelia Meyer, and 2 boys, Jorg Weber and Max Meyer. They had rented the Voyager in Los Angeles during a summer road trip through the American Southwest. And by the time this vehicle was discovered, these 4 people had already been missing for about 3 months. They were supposed to return the van in late July. They never did. They were supposed to fly back to Germany. They never boarded the flight. And as far as anyone could determine, they never contacted their families to say they had changed their plans. They had simply vanished. At first, though, what happened seemed fairly obvious. This was Death Valley in July. Temperatures could climb well above 110 degrees Fahrenheit. There was almost no shade, very little water, and the abandoned van was miles from anything that could reasonably be called civilization. So investigators figured the van had become disabled, the 4 Germans had gotten out, and they had tried to walk somewhere for help. And if that was what happened, then as terrible as it sounds, eventually search teams should find them. So they searched. People went through the surrounding desert on foot. Horses were brought in. Aircraft checked the area from above. Searchers examined canyons, washes, ridges, and the terrain surrounding the vehicle. They did find one intriguing clue. A beer bottle, some distance from the van that matched bottles found inside it. That suggested at least one person had walked away from the vehicle. But after that, nothing. No bodies, no clear trail, no discovery that explained where 4 people, including 2 children, had gone. Eventually, the search was called off. And that's when this stopped being just a tragic story about tourists getting stranded in the desert. Because if this family had simply walked away from the van and died nearby, where were they? For the next 13 years, nobody could answer that question. Then one man came along, studied the exact same mystery, and realized something almost everyone before him had missed. Maybe the problem wasn't that searchers hadn't looked hard enough. Maybe they had been looking in the wrong direction. To understand why that van ended up so deep in the desert, you have to go back to July of 1996, when none of this looked like a mystery yet. At that point, Egbert Rimkus and Cornelia Meyer were just two German tourists taking the kind of trip a lot of people dream about. They had come to the United States with two boys, Jorg Weber and Max Meyer, and they were traveling around the American West in a rented green Plymouth Voyager. And if you've ever done one of those long road trips out west, you know how easy it is to get a little ambitious. You look at a map and see Los Angeles, Las Vegas, Yosemite, national parks, deserts, mountains, and everything seems close enough that you start thinking, yeah, we can probably fit that in too. But the American West can fool you. On a map, two places might look like they're practically next door. In reality, there can be 100 miles of empty country between them. And when you get away from the interstate, a line printed on a map that looks like a road might turn out to be something completely different. That distinction would eventually become very important. The Germans had a deadline. Their vacation was almost over. The Voyager was due back in Los Angeles on July 26th, and they were supposed to fly home to Germany shortly afterward. So whatever they were doing during those final days, they couldn't wander indefinitely. They had to keep moving. Sometime around July 22nd, the group entered Death Valley. Now, if you've never been there, the name can make the place sound like one enormous flat bowl of sand. But Death Valley is much more complicated than that. There are mountains, narrow canyons, old mining roads, dry washes, isolated cabins, and huge stretches of terrain where you can travel for hours without seeing another person. And during the summer, the heat is brutal. Most tourists experience Death Valley from paved roads. They stop at overlooks, take photographs, visit developed areas, get back into an air-conditioned vehicle, and move on. Egbert and the others didn't do that. For reasons nobody can know with complete certainty, they began heading into increasingly remote country. At some point, they reached Warm Springs, an old mining area in the southern part of the park. There was a visitor register there, and the Germans left behind one of the most important pieces of evidence in the entire case. They signed their names. Along with the entry was a short message indicating that they were going over the pass. That line would become haunting later, because it showed investigators that these people weren't simply wandering around without any plan. They believed they were going somewhere. From Warm Springs, the route west leads toward Butte Valley, one of those places where the landscape starts to feel almost unreal. It's surrounded by mountains and desert, with old cabins left over from mining days. One of them is known as the geologist's cabin. Evidence found later strongly indicated that the Germans reached that area. And that's important, because by then they were already far away from the kind of roads an ordinary rental minivan was designed to handle. The obvious route out of Butte Valley continued toward Mengel Pass. And if you're looking at a map, this is where you might make a very understandable mistake. You see a line continuing west. You know there are roads on the other side. You know you're in a vehicle. So you think, okay, we just keep going. But Mengel Pass is not the sort of place where you casually drive a family minivan. The route becomes rough, rocky, and difficult. Even properly equipped four-wheel drive vehicles can have trouble in parts of that country. The Plymouth Voyager was not a four-wheel drive backcountry vehicle. It was a rental van. At some point, Egbert apparently realized they weren't going to make it through the way they had intended. And this is where their vacation seems to have changed from an adventure into a problem. They were deep in the desert. They had 2 children with them. Their flight home was approaching. And the route they had apparently planned to use was no longer realistic, so they needed another way out. Looking at the maps available to them, there appeared to be another possibility. Instead of continuing over the difficult pass, they could head in another direction through the desert and try to connect with roads farther south or west. On paper, it may have seemed reasonable. And I think that's one of the things that makes this story so unsettling. Because nothing about the next decision necessarily required somebody to be reckless or irrational. You can imagine sitting there with a map spread across the hood of the van, seeing a road marked in front of you and thinking, we came in this far. There has to be a way out. So they turned away from the route they had originally intended to take, and they began driving deeper into a section of Death Valley where almost nobody went. The farther they traveled, the worse the terrain became. The road narrowed, the desert closed around them, and every mile they drove made turning around and getting back to safety more difficult. But the van kept moving. Because somewhere ahead of them, according to the map, there was supposed to be a way out. And then they reached Anvil Spring Canyon. That was where the road finally started taking the van apart. By By the time Egbert Rimkus turned that green Plymouth Voyager away from the easier parts of Death Valley, he had already crossed a line that most tourists never even get close to. And the strange thing is, he may not have realized it. Because when you're sitting at home looking at a map, roads are simple. A thick line is a highway. A thin line is a smaller road. Maybe there's a dotted line for something rougher, but it still looks like a road. In Death Valley, that assumption can get you into serious trouble. A line on the map might mean there was once a mining track there 50 years ago. It might mean a route that exists only as 2 faint tire marks through loose rock. It might mean something that is technically passable, but only if you have high clearance, 4-wheel drive, recovery gear, extra fuel, extra water, and enough experience to know when to turn around. Egbert had none of those things. He had a rental minivan and 2 children in the back. The group had already reached Warm Springs, an abandoned mining settlement far from the main tourist areas. It was one of those strange little desert places where you can still see old buildings, rusted equipment, and the remains of lives that disappeared decades earlier. There, the Germans signed a visitor register. That mattered enormously later, because it gave investigators something they almost never get in a wilderness disappearance: a written breadcrumb. The message they left indicated that they were going over the pass. Most likely, that meant Mengele Pass. And if that was their plan, it actually makes sense at first. From Warm Springs, they could continue through Butte Valley, cross Mengele Pass, and eventually work their way west toward roads that would take them back toward civilization. At least, that's what the map suggested. They made it as far as Butte Valley. That alone tells you how determined they were, because this was no casual sightseeing loop. They were moving through increasingly rough terrain in a vehicle that was never intended to be there. Somewhere in that valley stood an old stone building called the Geologist's Cabin. Years later, investigators found evidence connecting the Germans to that cabin, which meant they had almost certainly reached it. Now imagine being there. It's July. You're in one of the hottest regions on Earth. Behind you are miles of rough desert road. Ahead of you is a mountain pass. You know your vacation is almost over. The rental van is due back in Los Angeles. You have a plane to catch. And you're probably thinking that the hard part is almost finished. Just get over the pass. Then you're out. But when they approached Mengele Pass, the reality of that little line on the map finally became obvious. The route climbed into rocky terrain that was completely wrong for a Plymouth Voyager. This wasn't a matter of being uncomfortable. The van physically could not handle what was ahead. Large rocks, steep sections, uneven ground. This was the kind of terrain where even experienced off-road drivers would stop, get out, study the route, and think carefully before continuing. Egbert apparently did exactly what most of us would hope we would do. He turned around. And that decision, by itself, was probably the right one. The problem came with what happened next. Because going back the way they had come would mean retracing a long, punishing route through the desert. They were already under time pressure. And when they looked at their map, there appeared to be another option. South of their position were tracks leading away from Butte Valley. If those tracks connected the way the map seemed to show, the Germans might be able to bypass Mengele Pass entirely and find another way out. So instead of retracing their route, they went south. And this is the point where the story begins to feel almost cruel. Because every individual decision still makes sense. Mengele Pass is too rough? Don't cross it? There's another road? Try that? You need to get back to Los Angeles soon? Take the route that seems shorter. Nothing about that sounds insane. But the map could not show them what the desert actually looked like. As the Voyager moved south, the road became worse. Not all at once. That's important. If you come around a corner and suddenly see a 10-foot cliff, you stop. But this kind of road tricks you gradually. First, it gets a little rougher. Then there are more rocks. Then the bushes start scraping the sides of the vehicle. Then you have to slow down for a washout. Then you tell yourself, well, we've already made it this far. And every time you get through one bad section, it encourages you to try the next one. Eventually, turning around feels harder than continuing. So the van kept going. At some point, they passed beyond the area where anyone was likely to stumble across them by accident. No gas station, no campground, no regular traffic, no ranger making routine rounds, just desert. And as they moved toward Anvil Spring Canyon, the terrain began narrowing around them. The road, if you could still call it that, became a primitive track through rock and gravel. The Voyager was taking a beating. And there was another problem the Germans could not see. By choosing this route, they were moving toward one of the most isolated corners of the region. They may have believed they were heading toward an exit. In reality, they were driving into a trap. Eventually, one of the tires failed. For most of us, a flat tire is annoying. Out there, it was the beginning of an emergency. Evidence found on the van later suggested they continued driving even after the tire was badly damaged. Think about what that means. They didn't stop and calmly decide the trip was over. They were trying to keep moving. Maybe they believed a better road was just ahead. Maybe Egbert thought that if he could push the van another mile, they would reach firmer ground. Maybe he could already see that turning around was becoming impossible. Whatever he was thinking, the van continued forward until the tire was destroyed and the wheel itself began taking damage. Still, they kept going. Another mile. Then another stretch. The metal wheel grinding against rock and dirt. A family minivan, loaded with luggage and 2 children, crawling deeper into the desert on a ruined tire. And eventually, the inevitable happened. The Voyager could go no farther. The engine still existed. The map still existed. Their belongings were still packed inside. But as far as transportation was concerned, they were finished. And now Egbert, Cornelia, Jorg, and Max were standing in Anvil Spring Canyon in the middle of July, surrounded by mountains and desert, miles from any reliable help. Behind them was the brutal road they had just traveled. Ahead of them was nothing that looked like civilization. And somewhere in the vehicle was a map that appeared to show one last possibility. Something south of them. Something huge. Something that, to 4 foreigners stranded in the desert, might have looked like the safest place they could possibly walk toward. What they could not know was that this final interpretation of the map would be far more dangerous than the broken van. At some point, the green Plymouth Voyager simply stopped being a vehicle. It became shelter. That difference matters, because up until then, Egbert and Cornelia still had options. As bad as the road was, as long as the van could move, they could keep telling themselves they were going to find their way out. Then the tire failed, and they kept driving. Investigators would later determine that the damage wasn't limited to a simple flat. The tire had been destroyed badly enough that the wheel itself was damaged, which meant the van had apparently been driven for a considerable distance after the tire was already gone. Just picture that for a second. You're sitting inside a rental minivan in the middle of the desert. Every rotation of the wheel produces another horrible grinding sound. The vehicle is shaking. Rocks are hitting the underside. You know you're damaging the van, but you keep pressing the accelerator anyway. Because stopping feels worse. Stopping means admitting that you're not temporarily delayed anymore. You're stranded. Eventually, somewhere in the rough terrain of Anvil Spring Canyon, the Voyager could go no farther. And now, the 4 Germans had a completely different problem. They were miles from any paved road. There was no cell phone service to call for help. And in 1996, even having a mobile phone while traveling internationally was nothing like it is today. There was no steady stream of tourists passing by, no gas station just over the hill, no ranger station within sight. There was the van, their supplies, the map, and an enormous amount of desert. And it was July. This is where it's easy, sitting somewhere comfortable, to say what they should have done. Stay with the vehicle. A vehicle is large. It's easier to see from the air. It provides shade. If anyone eventually comes looking, finding a green minivan is much easier than finding 4 people walking through miles of brown desert. That's good wilderness advice. But Egbert and Cornelia were not professional desert rescuers. And more importantly, they had no reason to believe a rescue operation was coming. Think about their situation from their point of view. Nobody back in Germany knew exactly where they were. The rental company knew the van would eventually be late, but they didn't know it was sitting in Anvil Spring Canyon. Their flight hadn't left yet. There was no emergency beacon transmitting their location. If they simply stayed beside the van, what exactly were they waiting for? A random person to come down a road that almost nobody used? A plane to notice them? Somebody in Los Angeles to somehow figure out that 4 missing tourists were stranded in this specific canyon? They couldn't know that 3 months later, a ranger would finally spot their van from the air. From where they were standing, staying put may have felt less like a safety strategy and more like waiting to die. So someone appears to have started scouting. Searchers would later find that beer bottle some distance away from the Voyager, matching bottles from inside the van. It's a tiny clue, but it matters, because it suggests that at least one person left the vehicle and walked out into the surrounding terrain. Maybe Egbert went first. That would make sense. He may have wanted to climb to higher ground, look for a road, study the terrain, or simply figure out whether anything recognizable was nearby. And if he did, imagine what he would have seen. Almost nothing. No town, no buildings, no moving cars, no telephone poles leading towards civilization. Just dry ridges, washes, mountains, and a horizon that offered no obvious answer. So he would have gone back to the only useful thing they had, the map. And this is probably where the decision that defined the entire case was made, because there were really only two choices. The first was to stay with the van. They had some protection from the sun. They had whatever water and supplies remained. They could hope somebody eventually came looking. The second was to walk. And walking meant gambling on one thing, that somewhere within reach, there were other people. The problem with desert distances is that they lie to you. A ridge that looks close might take an hour to reach. A mountain that looks a few miles away might be much farther. And when there are almost no trees, houses, or other familiar objects to give you a sense of scale, it's incredibly easy to underestimate distance. Add extreme heat, and every mile becomes more expensive. You sweat constantly. Your body loses water faster than you realize. You become tired, then slow, then confused. And one of the most dangerous things about severe dehydration is that the person suffering from it may no longer be making good decisions at exactly the moment when good decisions matter most. Egbert and Cornelia had an additional problem. They weren't only making this choice for themselves. 2 children were with them. That makes staying with the van seem even more logical to us now. But it could also have made the opposite decision feel more urgent to them. If Egbert believed help was within walking distance, how long would he be willing to sit there watching the water disappear? An hour? A day? 2 days? At some point, doing nothing can start to feel more dangerous than moving. And on their map, there were features outside the canyon that could easily have looked promising. There were roads, boundaries, developed areas farther away, places that, on paper, suggested human activity. The Germans did not know the landscape the way a local ranger did. They had no way of looking at one of those markings and instantly understanding, that doesn't mean what you think it means. So eventually, whether all 4 left together or one person first explored the route, the family appears to have made the decision that investigators would spend years trying to understand. They walked away from the van. That was the moment their disappearance truly began. Because once they left that large green vehicle behind, they became almost invisible. 4 small figures moving through thousands upon thousands of acres of rock, sand, canyon, and scrub. And with every step, the van, the one thing searchers would eventually be able to find, became farther away. They may have carried water. They may have carried food. They may have carried whatever they believed they needed. But there was one thing they almost certainly carried with them, a belief that they were walking toward help. And that's what makes what happened next so disturbing. Because 13 years later, when someone finally figured out where they had probably gone, it became clear that the Germans may not have wandered aimlessly at all. They may have chosen a destination. They may have followed the map exactly as they understood it. And that understanding may have taken them in the worst possible direction. 3 months passed before anyone finally found the van. On October 21st, 1996, a park ranger flying over the southern part of Death Valley happened to look down into Anvil Spring Canyon and spotted something green sitting among all that brown rock and dust. From the air, it looked completely wrong. Nothing about that canyon suggested a place where somebody would intentionally park a family minivan, especially one rented hundreds of miles away in Los Angeles. Once authorities reached the vehicle, they ran the information and learned that the Plymouth Voyager had been due back at the rental agency in July. Immediately, that changed everything. Now they weren't looking at an abandoned vehicle anymore. They were looking at the last known location of 4 missing people. Inside the van, investigators found the kinds of things you would expect a traveling family to keep with them: luggage, camping gear, clothing, and personal belongings. Outside, however, there was no family. More unsettling was the fact that nothing at the scene suggested they had been picked up by somebody else. No second vehicle had obviously come through. No note had been left behind. No clear message explained where they were going. Instead, it looked as though Egbert, Cornelia, Jorg, and Max had simply opened the doors, stepped into the desert, and disappeared. So rescuers began with the most reasonable assumption. Somewhere around that canyon, the 4 Germans had to be waiting. Or lying. Search teams moved outward from the van. People climbed ridges, followed washes, checked gullies, and studied the surrounding landscape for anything that did not belong there. Aircraft passed overhead. Horse teams covered terrain that would have been exhausting to search on foot. Experienced rescuers looked in the kinds of places where lost people usually end up: shaded areas, natural routes of travel, high points where someone might climb for a better view, and paths that seemed to lead toward help. Then they found something: a beer bottle. By itself, that sounds almost meaningless. Yet investigators knew there were similar bottles inside the Voyager, and this one had been found some distance away from the vehicle. Suddenly, they had what appeared to be the beginning of a trail. At least one person, it seemed, had left the van and gone that way. Naturally, searchers pushed farther out. Surely there would be another bottle. Perhaps there would be footprints protected somewhere from the wind. Maybe they would find a shirt, a backpack, a water container, or something dropped by one of the children. But the next clue never came. Day after day, the desert gave them nothing. Even that beer bottle created more questions than answers, because nobody could say with certainty who had carried it when it had been dropped, or whether the person had continued in the same direction afterward. Eventually, rescuers had to confront an uncomfortable reality. 4 people had walked away from a very large, very visible green van, and somehow trained search teams could not find any of them. That was hard to explain. Consider the children for a moment. Jorg and Max were not experienced desert hikers who could cover enormous distances quickly. Assuming the 4 stayed together, their pace would have been limited by the boys, the heat, the terrain, and however much water they were carrying. Because of that, the search area should have had a practical limit. You would expect exhaustion to stop them. Dehydration should stop them. Mountains and canyons should funnel them towards certain routes. Eventually, something should leave a trace. Still, nothing did. As the search continued, another possibility began hanging over the case. What if they had not simply died near the van? Maybe someone had encountered them. Perhaps they had somehow reached another road? Could they have gotten into somebody else's vehicle and left the area? For a while, almost any explanation seemed possible, because the one explanation that should have been easiest to prove, 4 stranded tourists dying in the surrounding desert, was producing absolutely no bodies. Authorities also found no convincing evidence of foul play. There was no obvious sign that the family had been attacked at the van. Nothing clearly suggested a robbery or kidnapping. Yet the absence of evidence did not solve the central problem. By October 26th, after days of intensive searching, the major operation was suspended. Think about how strange that must have felt. Searchers knew exactly where the Germans' vehicle had stopped. They knew roughly when the family had been there. They knew the van could no longer continue. They even had evidence suggesting somebody had walked away from it. And despite all of that, 4 human beings had seemingly dissolved into the desert. Over the following years, the case took on a life of its own. Some people wondered whether the family had intentionally disappeared. Others imagined criminals, smugglers, or some bizarre encounter in the wilderness. A few theories became even stranger because a massive military reservation, naval air weapons station, China Lake, occupied land to the west and south of the area. Without bodies, almost any theory could survive. Meanwhile, the Green Voyager remained the one solid anchor in the story. Everything before that van could be reconstructed. Everything after it was blank. For 13 years, that blank space defeated everyone who tried to fill it. Then, more than a decade later, an experienced search and rescue volunteer named Tom Mahood became interested in the disappearance. He studied the maps. Next, he examined the old search information. Soon, he started thinking carefully about the route the Germans had taken and the decisions they would have faced after the van became disabled. What bothered him was not that the original searchers had done a poor job. Quite the opposite. Those teams had searched the places that made sense. And that was exactly the problem. Because Mahood eventually realized that everyone had been asking where a knowledgeable American desert traveler would go after becoming stranded. Nobody had really asked where Egbert Rimkus, a German tourist holding a map of an unfamiliar desert, would believe he needed to go. Once Mahood asked that question, one particular feature on the map suddenly became very difficult to ignore. It lay south of the abandoned van. Previous searches had not focused heavily in that direction. And if Mahood was right about what the Germans thought they were looking at, then the family's disappearance was about to make horrifying sense. For the next 13 years, the disappearance of Egbert Rimkus, Cornelia Meyer, Jorg Weber, and Max Meyer sat in that uncomfortable space between a solved tragedy and a genuine mystery. Everyone could see the most likely ending, but nobody could actually prove it. Authorities assumed the family had probably died somewhere in the desert, yet that answer created an obvious problem. If 4 people had walked away from the van, why had an enormous search found almost nothing? Over time, the empty space around that question started filling up with theories. Some people wondered whether the Germans had reached another road and been picked up by someone. Others suggested they might have encountered criminals, stumbled into something dangerous, or deliberately vanished for reasons nobody understood. None of those ideas came with the kind of evidence you would need to turn speculation into an answer. Meanwhile, the desert itself seemed to support every possibility because it had preserved almost no obvious trail. Years passed, and the case became one of those Death Valley stories that simply did not sit right. Experienced searchers understood how brutal that country could be, but they also understood something else. 4 people do not become ghosts. Even in a place as huge as Death Valley, people move according to terrain, water, roads, shade, and whatever destination they believe they are trying to reach. Somewhere, there had to be a logic to what happened after the family left the van. That was what eventually caught the attention of Tom Mahood. Mahood was an experienced search and rescue volunteer who knew the California desert, and when he began digging into the German tourists' case, he did not have some magical new piece of evidence that everyone else had missed. Instead, he had the same basic ingredients that had been sitting there for years. There was the abandoned Voyager. Beside that, clue sat the damaged wheel. Another piece was the beer bottle. Then there were the old maps, the search records, the visitor register, and the known route through Warm Springs and Boot Valley. Yet Mahood kept coming back to a simple problem. The original search had been conducted by people who knew how a lost person should behave in the desert. Naturally, those searchers looked along routes that made sense to them. They checked places where someone might seek shade, climb for visibility, return toward known roads, or head for locations that a local person would recognize as possible help. Nothing about that approach was careless. In fact, it was exactly what trained rescuers were supposed to do. But Mahood began to wonder whether that professionalism had created a blind spot. Suppose Egbert was not thinking like a California search and rescue volunteer. Imagine instead that he was thinking like what he actually was, a German tourist, standing beside a broken rental van, holding a map of a country he did not know, with a woman and 2 children depending on him. Suddenly, the question changed. Rather than asking, where should they have gone? Mahood began asking, where would they have believed they were going? That tiny difference changed almost everything. A local person can look at a map symbol and instantly understand what it means on the ground. Someone from another country may look at the same symbol and build an entirely different picture in his head. Likewise, an experienced desert traveler sees empty land and thinks about distance, exposure, water, and whether a road is really a road. A tourist may see a named place, a boundary, or a marked facility and assume that somewhere nearby there must be people. So Mahood started rebuilding the story from inside Egbert's head. First, he considered what the family knew when the van became disabled. Behind them was the rough route they had already driven. Ahead of them were mountains, canyons, and open desert. Around them, there was no obvious civilization. On the map, however, there were features that suggested something very different. One possibility in particular kept pulling Mahood's attention south. Earlier search efforts had concentrated heavily in other directions because those routes seemed more logical to people familiar with the terrain. South, by comparison, looked awful. The country was difficult, dry, isolated, and did not offer the kind of obvious destination an experienced local would normally choose, which was precisely why Mahood became interested in it. If the Germans had gone south, the original search could have missed them, not because rescuers were incompetent, but because the family had made a choice that only made sense from their own understanding of the map. Still, a theory is easy to invent. Proof is much harder. Mahood knew that before he could justify walking miles into that country, he needed to test whether the route actually fit the evidence. So he studied distances. Then he examined the terrain. Next, he thought about how much ground 2 adults and 2 children might realistically cover in extreme heat. After that, he compared those limits with the old search areas. Slowly, a gap began to appear. It was not a dramatic blank spot that everyone had simply forgotten. Instead, it was a narrow kind of possibility, hidden between what searchers thought the family would do and what the family themselves may have believed. That possibility led toward a place marked on the map in a way that would mean one thing to a local and something very different to a stranded foreign tourist. For Mahood, that was the moment the case stopped looking like 4 people had simply wandered into nowhere. Perhaps they had been trying to reach something specific. Maybe they had left the van with a destination in mind. And if he could figure out exactly what they thought was waiting for them out there, he might finally know where to look. Mahood kept staring at the map because one thing about it bothered him. Everyone who knew the desert had been thinking about the problem like a local. If your vehicle dies out there, you stay with it. Conserve water, look for shade, and if you absolutely have to move, you head towards something you know is real. A road, a spring, a ranger station, some place where people actually go. Egbert Rimkus did not know the desert like that. He was a German tourist with a rental van, 2 children, a woman traveling with him, and a flight home that was getting closer by the hour. Whatever map he carried was not just a navigation tool anymore. Once the van became useless, that map was basically the only thing telling him where another human being might be. So Mahood tried something simple. Instead of asking, "Where would I go?" he asked, "What would Egbert think he was looking at?" Down there, on the map, was a huge military reservation connected with China Lake. Now, if you grew up around the deserts of the American West, the words military reservation do not necessarily make you picture a guarded front gate every few miles. A place like China Lake is enormous. Much of its security comes from sheer distance and emptiness. In remote sections, you can reach a boundary and see no guard shack, no soldiers, no line of vehicles, and sometimes not even a fence that looks the way you expect a military perimeter to look. But Mahood wondered what those same words meant to Egbert. Imagine you are from Germany and someone tells you there is a military installation a few miles away. What picture appears in your head? Probably fences, gates, patrols, buildings, soldiers, maybe a road running along the perimeter. Most importantly, people. Suddenly, the southward route that looked ridiculous to experienced desert searchers began to make a strange kind of sense. From the Germans' position, Mahood estimated that the China Lake boundary was only a few miles away in that direction. On a map, that can look close enough to walk. If Egbert believed the boundary meant he would encounter a fence or a patrol road, then leaving the van was no longer some desperate march into nowhere. In his mind, it might have been a short walk to help. And once Mahood saw that possibility, he began rebuilding what may have happened step by step. Perhaps the family remained with the van for a while after it became disabled. Evidence around the site suggested they had spent some time there, so this may not have been a panicked decision made seconds after the wheel failed. Maybe Egbert took a bottle of beer and walked down the canyon alone to scout ahead. That would explain why a matching bottle was later found away from the vehicle. From somewhere around that point, he could have stopped, looked at the landscape, checked the map, and tried to solve the problem exactly the way any father might. Going back meant returning over miles of miserable road. Continuing by vehicle was impossible. Waiting beside the van offered no guarantee that anyone would ever come. But south? South appeared to offer the edge of a military facility. Mahood imagined Egbert looking at that boundary and thinking, "If I can get my family there, someone will find us." That idea also helped explain something else that had always seemed odd. There was shelter and water behind them around Anvil Spring and the old stone cabin area, but those things solved the wrong problem. The Germans were not necessarily thinking, "How do we survive here for several days?" They may have been thinking, "How do we get out of here today?" Their rental van was due back. Their return flight was approaching. Nothing at that moment told them they were about to become the subjects of a 13-year mystery. If Egbert believed soldiers were only a few miles away, going back to a cabin and waiting could have felt like wasting precious time. So, in Mahood's reconstruction, the family may have spent the night near the van and then left early, while the temperature was still more manageable. They would head east down Anvil Canyon, past the general area where the bottle had been found, and then turn south. That was essentially Mahud's southerly scenario, the family walking toward the China Lake boundary because they expected rescue there. At first, the plan might even have seemed to be working. Every step south brought the line on the map closer. The trouble was that the line existed much more clearly on paper than it did in the real world. There was no magical moment when the family would crest a hill and see a giant fence with armed guards waiting behind it. Nor was there any reason a patrol had to be passing exactly where they reached the reservation boundary. In fact, Mahud knew from his own experience with desert military land that a person could approach that kind of boundary and see almost nothing announcing that they had arrived. Later searches in the same area found exactly that sort of landscape. A military boundary that existed on maps and GPS screens without an obvious physical marker in front of you. Just more rock. Scrub stretched in every direction. Mountains blocked the horizon. Heat pressed down on everything. Picture what that would do to you psychologically. You walk for hours because you believe the destination is 4 miles away. Then you reach the place where the map says help should begin, and there is nothing there. So you tell yourself the actual fence must be a little farther. You keep walking. Another ridge appears. Surely there will be a road on the other side. There isn't. Then you notice something in the distance that might be a structure, a tower, or simply the kind of feature your exhausted brain desperately wants to be man-made. Now turning around becomes harder than continuing. Because the van is behind you. Water is disappearing. The children are tired. And after walking this far, admitting that the plan was wrong means accepting that you may not have enough strength or enough water to undo it. This was the part of Mahud's theory that made the case suddenly feel much darker. The Germans might not have been lost in the usual sense. They may have known exactly which direction they wanted to travel. Their compass heading could have been deliberate. Even their destination could have been chosen before they left the van. The fatal error was not failing to have a plan. It was having a plan based on one assumption that was completely wrong. Mahud also realized why the original searchers might have missed them. Professional teams had concentrated on routes that made survival sense, and moving south toward empty military land did not look like a sensible choice. The original search had been extensive and involved multiple search and rescue groups, but Mahud's later theory pointed toward terrain that had not been treated as the obvious answer. Why would a stranded family with children walk into harsher, more isolated terrain when other options existed? Because Mahud thought they did not believe they were walking into isolation. They believed they were walking out of it. Once that idea took hold, he compared it against everything else. The bottle, the terrain, the family's time pressure, the military boundary, and the areas searched back in 1996. For the first time, the empty space on the map no longer looked empty. It looked like a route. And somewhere along that route, if his theory was right, 4 people who had been missing for 13 years might still be waiting to be found. All Mahud had to do now was walk into the desert and see whether the Germans had really gone south. On November 11th, 2009, Tom Mahud picked up Les Walker and drove back toward Death Valley with a plan that, on paper, probably sounded a little insane. By then, Mahud had spent months staring at maps, studying the old search records, walking portions of the terrain, and convincing himself that the Germans had most likely gone south from Anvil Canyon. At this point, he no longer wanted another theory. What he wanted was something physical. So the 2 men loaded water, navigation equipment, emergency gear, and everything they would need to spend time in one of the most isolated sections of the park, then headed into the desert. Early the next morning, they began working through the broad alluvial area Mahud had identified as the most promising place to search. Instead of staying together shoulder to shoulder, the men spread out enough to cover more ground while keeping in radio contact. Around them was exactly the kind of landscape that had defeated searchers 13 years earlier. Low hills, washes, loose rock, scattered brush, and huge open spaces where something lying only a short distance away could disappear from view. Then Les called over the radio. At first, what he had found did not sound dramatic. He thought he was looking at pieces of toilet paper caught in some bushes. Closer inspection changed that immediately. Those scraps were actually pages from a daily planner, and the writing on them was German. Suddenly, Mahud knew they were no longer searching an abstract theory. Nearby, Les found more material connected to the missing travelers, including business cards from places the Germans had visited during their trip. Inside that same area lay the remains of a small shoe. Before Mahud could fully process what those objects meant, another message came over the radio. This time, Les said they had bones. Mahood was several hundred meters away, up near a saddle overlooking the terrain, so he hurried down toward him. When he reached the site, white skeletal material was visible, scattered across a wide area below a small cliff. Beside the remains was something even more decisive, a wallet containing identification cards bearing Cornelia Meyer's name. For 13 years, the Germans had seemed to vanish after leaving the green van. Now Mahood and Walker were standing among the first unmistakable evidence of where at least some of them had gone. Yet the location was almost as important as the discovery itself. This was south of the van, exactly where Mahood's reconstruction had told him to look. Nothing about that moment proved every detail of his theory. Perhaps the family had chosen a slightly different route than the one he imagined. Maybe they changed direction several times after leaving Anvil Canyon. Still, the central idea had been right. Somehow they had crossed country that earlier searchers had not considered the most likely place for a stranded family with 2 children to travel. And by doing that, they had moved beyond the area where the original search expected to find them. Within hours, the discovery was reported to park and law enforcement officials, and suddenly a case that had been quiet for more than a decade was active again. A few weeks later, the desert filled with searchers. Teams from multiple agencies came in under an operation organized by the Inyo County Sheriff's Office, with roughly 27 people and 3 dogs actively searching in the field while additional personnel handled support. Helicopters inserted teams into remote landing zones because simply reaching the area on foot would consume too much time and energy. Once dropped off, searchers worked around the original discovery site, nearby canyons, and routes extending south toward the China Lake boundary. Even these trained rescuers, carrying modern equipment and working with organized support, found the place brutally remote. During the search, more skeletal pieces appeared around the hillside. Eventually, bright survey tape marked numerous locations where remains or possible evidence had been found. Because the terrain drained through washes, years of flash floods, animal activity, wind, and exposure had scattered material over a broad area. Later, forensic recovery teams returned to collect what could be collected, while other searches continued trying to answer the question everyone was now asking. Where were the children? Months afterward, investigators were able to recover usable DNA from one of the bones. That DNA matched Egbert Rimkus's family in Germany with a very high level of confidence, finally giving authorities a positive identification for at least one of the adults. Meanwhile, the female remains, found with Cornelia's identification and personal belongings, strongly pointed toward Cornelia Meyer, although the available forensic material did not initially provide the same kind of DNA confirmation. No definitive identification of Georg or Max came from the first major recovery effort. Later searches complicated that picture a little further. Authorities reportedly recovered children's shoes and small bones that were considered possible remains of the boys, but public information about the final forensic results remained incomplete. Mahood himself eventually wrote that he never received a clear answer confirming additional identifications. So even after the adults had effectively been found, a piece of the family's story remained unresolved. From the evidence that did survive, though, the broad outline of their final journey became much easier to imagine. Maybe Egbert first scouted away from the van and returned with the belief that help lay to the south. Perhaps Cornelia gathered the boys, water, and whatever supplies they thought they could carry. Either way, the family appears to have left the shelter of that green Voyager and committed themselves to walking across open desert. 1 mile would have become 2. Another ridge would have revealed another stretch of empty ground. Worse still, each hour would have raised the temperature while lowering whatever water they had left. Somewhere along the way, the assumption behind the entire plan must have begun collapsing. There was no obvious military gate waiting for them. No patrol vehicle appeared over the horizon. Instead, the landscape kept opening into more desert. At that point, turning back may already have been impossible. According to Mahood's later reconstruction, the most plausible route brought them through difficult country toward the upper alluvial fan where the remains were eventually found. In places, that route is so punishing that even experienced searchers regarded the area as exceptionally remote. Yet 4 tourists, including 2 children, apparently made it far enough that their bodies ended up miles away from the vehicle that everyone originally assumed they would stay near. Years of mystery had made their disappearance seem almost supernatural. Their actual fate was probably much simpler and much crueler. No hidden killer was required. Neither was an elaborate conspiracy. Just a damaged tire, a bad route, unbearable heat, limited water, unfamiliar terrain, and one reasonable-looking assumption on a map. Mahood had solved the mystery not because he discovered some secret clue nobody else possessed, but because he stopped asking what the Germans should have done. He asked what they believed they were doing. What emerged from that question was a family that probably did not walk blindly into the desert at all. They were trying to save themselves. Every difficult mile may have felt like progress. Each ridge may have carried the promise that people would finally appear on the other side. Until eventually there was no water, no strength, and no next ridge worth reaching. 13 years later, two men followed that same logic into the desert and found what hundreds of search hours had missed. The terrible irony was that the Germans may have spent their final hours believing rescue was somewhere directly ahead of them. In reality, the decision they thought was leading them back to civilization had carried them farther from the only place rescuers would eventually know to look. Thanks so much for watching today's story, and let me know in the comments what you think really happened during that family's final walk through Death Valley. If you want more true stories where one wrong decision turns an ordinary trip into something almost impossible to explain, there's plenty more waiting for you here. Go ahead and pick another story, and I'll meet you there.